everyone for being here today. I am very pleased to open this first conference for the first edition of the European Conclave. And we're here in beautiful Cascais. The sun is shining, and we're looking out at the sea. I think we can really start imagining where do we want to go in the future, and what are the new horizons and the new worlds that we are sailing into. So, as you know, we're going to spend here the next 3 days to imagine the future of Europe and to come up with a new narrative and new ideas of where does Europe have to go in 2040. And there is no better time to think about this because, of course, 2024, next year, will be one of the most important years, not only for Europe, but for the world, in deciding the path that we're going through. And the past, I'd like to say a couple of years, but to be honest, we're talking about a couple of decades. We've been going through crisis after crisis after crisis, just recently, obviously, with aggression and wars breaking out, not only just on the border with Europe, but also back again in Israel. And we've had a global pandemic. And I think all these issues show how interconnected this new world is, this 21st century world, how everything is linked. Something happening on one side of the world will have repercussions on the other. It will have repercussions on other issues, whether it is how an outbreak reaches then into an energy crisis that then becomes a food crisis. So all of these things are interconnected. And I think we've all realized how much this is so and how much we need to rethink a global world order that counts for this, and that is based on collaboration and trust and saying how can we go through the challenges that we know we will have to face. There's all the information and evidence from scientists showing what the challenges are going to be in the next couple of decades because of climate change or the climate crisis, just to name a few. So this is a wonderful time to come together and say, what is Europe's role in this new world? And what should Europe be focusing on? In the next couple of days, you'll hear from a lot of very interesting people with a lot of experience on different perspectives and the different challenges that Europe is going to face. But before delving into that, we wanted to have a conversation about how the rest of the world sees Europe. I have worked in Brussels for nearly 2 decades, and I know how very navel-gazing we can be sometimes, and we just see things from our perspectives, and we get focused around our issues. And so we thought the starting point should really be to lift up our eyes and look at the horizons and see how does the rest of the world see this, and what does the rest of the world need Europe to do, to be as a kind of inspiration, as a starting point for the debates of the coming days. So we're very delighted to have here with us a wonderful list of eminent speakers from all across the world who will be able to share with us their perspectives. But before delving into that, I would like to give the floor to the chairman of the board of the Conclave and also the force behind this wonderful initiative, Mr. Guillaume Clossard.
Many thanks, Erika. And as you say, we are in a very inspiring place where we can try to invent the future because we have a responsibility, a common responsibility for that. Bon dia. Hi, everybody, and bonjour à tous. So with my fellows of the Conclave, we have the privilege to welcome you here for the first edition of the Conclave Public Conference in the Cultural Center of Cascais, which is hosting us. And in this respect, I'd like first to start with a series of thinking. We would like to thank for the support the municipality, the mayor and the deputy mayor of Cascais, but also all our Portuguese partners, and first of all, the President of the Republic that we saw yesterday evening, Marcelo Rebelo da Sousa, and our Portuguese partner, I mean the government of Portugal, Banco de Portugal, the Gulbenkian Foundation, and Cunha Vaz e Associado. And I want also to say thank you very much to our European partner, be they foundation or companies. Well, Erika spoke about the challenge. The world of yesterday is dead, and the world order of tomorrow is not born. So we are in a transition. And in this period of transition, everybody is lost. That's the reality. And when you are lost, and in addition, when there is a major technological transformation and a major climate change transition, you need to reinvent yourself. And that is the responsibility that we have. We need to reinvent ourselves, and we need to revive our DNA so that we can give some references to the citizen. Because otherwise, it is populism everywhere. And that is the situation in which we are. The temptation for self-retreat, the temptation for populism. And in this kind of period, people, political leadership, sometimes business leadership, even intellectual leadership, are always thinking about the short term. They forget the medium and the longer term. And they focus on crisis management. And by focusing on crisis management, they lose themselves, they lose their team, and they lose their capacity to lead. We are in this kind of period. But at the same time, it is that kind of period where few people, when they start to think and they start to share, these people can be very influential. Because everybody needs guidance, everybody needs reflection, everybody needs to pose the right problem. The philosophy of the conclave is very humble. We don't want to give answer. We don't want to give solution. What we really want to do is to try to pose the right question and transform them into the right problem. And if we are able to do that, we might be in a situation to do a real contribution to a better world. That is the objective of the conclave, limited to the European Union. As Erika said, we are in a period which is very timely because we are going to have European election next year. And it's also the moment when the political leadership start to think about what should be the European priorities for the European Union. And head of state and government will have to decide by next June what should be these priorities. They just start to think. And our objective is to put a contribution on their table. That's the objective of the conclave. This contribution should be limited on 4 domains, and it's already a lot. Geopolitics. In fact, what kind of power, what kind of contribution Europe wants to have for the future, let's say by 2040. In terms of technology, because today's technology drives both geopolitics, power, but also economic growth. Do we want to be a technological power? Because we are not anymore, at least the one we were to used to be. In common goods, which was the DNA of Europe regarding climate change, energy, research, education, health, what kind of contribution we want for Europe on these topics, and in terms of democracy. Do we believe that we can reinforce both national democracy and European democracy? Which role do we want for the citizen? Can we develop a European democracy and make enlargement at the same time? Well, that's an example of topic we are going to discuss. I don't know the one we are going to fix on, but I'm sure, we will select the right one, and we will work on them. That's the objective of our conclave. Maybe I may say a word on how the idea came out. In fact, I think a bit more than 1 year ago, I spoke with a European commissioner. And I will not say the name of him or her. He just told me, I'm just back from Kiev, and that is the first time that I start to know my fellow of the European Commission. And I start to discuss about the future. But the reality is, nowadays, we have no time to think beyond the crisis. And we need help. We need help. And this was a kind of paradox for me, because in the European system and within the European institutions, the European Commission should have been and used to be the place for longer term. It's not anymore. We discuss with some of my fellows here, and we understood that at national level it was worse, much worse, because there are day-to-day crises, there are inflation, there are the energy issue, there is the war, there are so many things to deal with that nobody has time to think the day after. So some of us, and they are here, consider that we need to develop a new place to think the future of Europe. A place which should not be a political conference, which should not be a business conference, which should not be a scientific conference, which should not be a think tank conference, but just a forum, transdisciplinarity, with different generations, with people from everywhere, but who share the same conviction. We need to gather the brightest brain of this continent in order just to identify the key issue for this continent. And we want to be influential, and we want to be responsible. That's basically the idea of the conclave. So now you could say, but conclave, it's a very religious name. Well, where are we? Well, we are in a church. Well, this is the DNA of Europe, but the fact is, the reality is, the name came from the fact that we became aware that conclave was also used internationally. For example, it seems that in India, they organize some conclave for conference they want a result from. So why not? We have a conclave. It means that we are going to work together for a certain number of days, and that we are going to leave each other when the white smoke is going to come out. That's the objective. We will see. And after, we will make a report, and we will try to be influential. That's it. You know everything. You need to know that this conference is recorded, which is not going to be the case of the conclave. There will be not takers. You are free to speak. But what is very, very important now is we are going to have a dialogue with non-European, or at least people not from the EU. And we have the opportunity to listen. This is a listening conference. And listening is a condition for a good talk. And a good talk creates the condition for a good challenge. And after,
We can set the basis for new dialogue. So it's important because also it's a matter of philosophy. We need to talk, but before talking, we need to listen. Have a good day, have fun, and thank you to all of you to be here. Have a good conclave.
Thank you very much, Guillaume, and thank you for highlighting the enormous ambition of these 3 days, and also the threat that unless we come up with any good ideas, we might change from being in a conference situation to a hostage situation. So, no, joking aside, as we're here to listen, I would like to introduce the moderator for the first panel discussion, who is Mr. Philippe Etienne, Ambassador of France in Germany and the US, and former advisor to the French President of the Republic.
Well, thank you very much. My role will consist only in inviting 3 other people to join me on this stage, actually. But indeed, I have been 13 years in Brussels in the French Permanent Representation, and the European Union is my passion. Having served lastly, before I retired as Ambassador of France to the United States, I also share now another passion, which is that the future of the European Union cannot be, of course, envisaged independently from the world around us, but also, as Guillaume said, without listening to our allies and partners all over the world. So, may I invite to come to this stage. First, I will not make any order, but ladies first. Maja Piszczewicz, who is a fellow of the Atlantic Council and vice president of the East-West Institute, who lives in Belgrade. All first. Pedro Miguel da Costa e Silva, a Brazilian ambassador to the European Union in Brussels. And Tony Gardner, a good friend, former ambassador of the United States to the European Union.
Usually the mics don't work, but this one seems to work. Good sign. I'm really happy to host the 3 of you here, and quite moved to be the moderator, because as I told Maya, my first post as a young French diplomat a long time ago was in Belgrade, in the former Yugoslavia. So I would ask first, as a matter of giving the opportunity to our panelists to introduce themselves, each of them starting with you, Maya, to explain your personal relation. Well, you are a European also, but to the European Union, if possible, and to these issues. And I will ask the same question for a way of introducing themselves to Pedro and to Tony. Maya.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Ambassador. I'm really, first of all, grateful to be here and very excited to be here, especially about this inspiring introduction that we just heard about our responsibility. I was hoping that you would say that unless we come up, or the conclave comes with conclusions, no one will be able to leave Kashkash, because that would be a good thing not to reach the conclusion. But still, this is really a beautiful place, so thank you for being here. I come from Belgrade, Serbia. I was born in Yugoslavia a long time ago. At that time, the only region without borders in Europe, and now the only region with borders in Europe, even more borders than we hope it will have soon. My background at this point, I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. As they say, they keep me in Belgrade as eyes and ears in the Western Balkans. And there's a lot to see and to hear in the Western Balkans, more than some of us would hope for at this point. Before this position, I lived in New York for a short period of time as a vice president of the East-West Institute. I was the head of the American Chamber of Commerce, worked with USAID, but my most important transformational experience happened in 2012 when I was invited to become a fellow at Francis Fukuyama's famous program, Rule of Law Development and Democracy at Stanford. And ever since then, I'm really passionately working on these issues, and in addition to those, on regional integration, for which I really hope that is the future of peace in the Balkans.
Thank you. Hvala lepo. Pedro, I think you have quite a personal relation with Europe.
Yes. Good afternoon. Boa tarde a todos. I'm Brazilian, and I'm as Philippe said, I'm the ambassador of Brazil to the European Union. So what I do every day is related to the European Union and its relations to Brazil. But I told him that I had a secret. I am married to a Portuguese from Alcântara, so half my heart is Portuguese. I have two Portuguese Brazilian sons. I studied here in Lisbon, history. As a diplomat before Brussels, I also served in Madrid. I served in Switzerland. I studied part of my life also in Europe. So a long history of relationship with Europe, and I'm very happy to be here today. And I hope that even though I'm still in an official capacity, that I'll be able to be frank and share some suggestions and ideas.
Muito obrigado. Another representative of another big partner and ally, who was also a personal, I think, relation with Europe. Dear Tony, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. So I'm supposed to be representing the U.S. view, but I'm not sure there is a U.S. view on the European Union. It's very divided. Donald Trump, if he comes back to power, clearly wants to break up the EU and thought it would break up, but I'm assuming that we're talking about the non-Trumpian view. And I'm not quite sure I'm the right person as well, because this is the personal aspect. I spent 35 years of my life in Europe. I'm a dual U.S. and Italian national. My wife is Spanish. My kids have two nationalities, U.S. and Spanish. My whole life, professional life, has been in Europe, and much of it related to the EU. So I was ambassador to the European Union, 2014, 2017, and I started my interest in the EU thanks to Professor Tsoukalis, who's here at Oxford, and then I went on to the European Commission, where I was a stagiaire, then I worked on the EU law in Brussels, and then I went to work in the White House with Clinton. And one of the anecdotes I love saying is that when I arrived on the first day at the National Security Council, I said, I want to focus on the European Union. The answer from my boss was, that's great, no one else is interested in that stuff. And so I said, that's great. So I had a lot of opportunity at a young age. But the EU has been my main professional interest, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And I must say, I'm especially grateful to have such an American representative, because we are in the period of a Thanksgiving holiday, and Thanksgiving is really important for the family life of every U.S. citizen. So now, I would like to ask you two questions. The first one would be, if we can take them in this order, what is your view of what the European Union is today? And the second question will be, what would you like the European Union to be in the future, and especially from an American, Brazilian, or a European, non-EU European West Balkans perspective? What role should play the EU in the world as it is emerging, as Guillaume said in his introduction, as a new order, a new world is to be born? May I start? Maybe we will do each time in reverse order. Maybe I can start with you, Tony, and Maya will start the second round on the future of the EU.
So how we see the EU today. Well, I'll give an answer which I'm not sure will be shared by even all of those in the Biden administration, and I think it's relevant to say I'm working on the re-election campaign, so clearly I'm a Democrat. I've worked with many democratic administrations. But many of those who are in the State Department, I think in the White House, may agree with what I'm going to say. I think the EU is a superpower in some areas and is often not only maligned, but underestimates its influence in a number of areas. And I lived it and witnessed it, not only in trade, in climate, but also in sanctions and in other areas, to be clear, which I also lived through. It is, as we all know, it's not very original to say, a trendsetter, particularly in regulation on critical areas for our future. And it's not only data privacy. It may well end up being also AI as an early starter, and also in competition policy, where the U.S. was away without leave, AWOL, for a long time. Not now. The Biden administration has become much more activist. But I think there are sources of real influence worldwide. Related to that point, however, and here I'll be a bit critical, I'm sorry, I want to be a bit provocative. I think sometimes the EU tries to do too much. And I say this also as someone who's been in the private sector. It needs to focus on its specific areas of competence where it really adds something to the equation. Certainly sanctions has reminded many people in the White House that the EU actually has value-added tools and can help the United States achieve common goals of relevance on the world stage. But the EU tries to do too much, and I'll start with the organogram of the EEAS. It tries to be everywhere, it tries to be relevant everywhere, and it should tailor its ambitions to where it really can add something. And when it tries to do everything, it irritates its partners, and it needs to speak with one voice better on the world stage. I have more to say about that. I don't know whether we should do it later or now.
Yes, we can come back to this later. If you mean, I think I see what you mean when you say one voice. I understand. I think many people understand. But first, let's go further with Pedro and the Brazilian view of what is the EU today.
I don't know if I have such a clear-cut answer as Tony, because to us, they use many things, starting one of our important partners, international relations, and when we have to make it differentiate between the EU and its member states, which is something that we can also talk about later, because sometimes people don't really get that difference, the EU institutions and how the EU functions, and then the interest of the member states and how that comes together. But coming back, I think the EU is an important partner for Brazil. We have historic connections, we have shared values, we have a lot of issues that are of common interest and where we can work together, not only bilaterally, but at the regional level and at the multilateral level. And you will ask a second question of where we want the EU to be, or what we want the EU to be, but I would complement saying that if at the same time we have a very positive agenda with the EU, and in the case of Brazil we have a strategic partnership with the EU also poses a challenge. The EU is one of our main markets in trade. The EU is an important partner in investment in Brazil. And while we recognize the importance of the EU in trying to create rules, like Tony said, set a bit the way and try to direct, sometimes, even though the intentions are good, the results are not so positive. And they create challenges for us. So I was listening to the president, to the introductory speech about the EU needing to listen more to other countries. I would add that not only should it listen more, but it should listen to what it's saying to other countries. More important than listening to us is, because sometimes the things that are said, you don't really realize what you're saying, and it's complicated. This rule setting and the agenda setting, it should only go so far, because other countries have other priorities and other agendas. So I think that the biggest contribution that the EU can give is by example, because it is an institution, an organization that works based on consensus building, and that I think should be its path forward. I answered a bit also your second question, but
yes,
I can come back to that.
Well, it is normal. It is normal because the separation between my two questions is a bit artificial, and it's normal that you introduce the next round. Maya, and since you will be the first to say what you think
I'm allowed to speak about the future as well.
Exactly. You can introduce the second round.
Thank you. Actually, this first question reminded me, I knew it reminded me of something, and I just remembered the famous old story, I think it was over 500 years before Christ, of the 5, or I don't know how many, blind men describing the elephant, but each having to touch only one part of it. And so the elephant in this room is obviously the EU. But from I hear so far, I think we are pretty close in describing the whole elephant, not just the tail or his ears or the legs. You know, looking at the EU from the Western Balkans, and I'm happy that I don't have to talk about the position of Washington, although I'm from the Atlantic Councils, because we will hear that opinion very credible. But looking for the Western Balkans, there's a saying in our part of the world, in Europe, not in the EU. It's a humorous saying describing our accession path to EU. What we do is we pretend to reform, and the EU pretends to negotiate with us. And that's how people describe it. This cynicism is very dangerous, and it has deep roots with causes on both sides. You know, started from 2003, famous Thessaloniki summit, and the promise given to the Western Balkans that the European future is for them, awaiting them to get there and become members, to this period of time, which is deep in crisis, and European future of the countries of the Western Balkans seems at least as far as it was in 2003. Maybe not for all countries the same, but generally that is the situation. In the meantime, we have a Zeitenwende. And it is truly a game changer for everything that's happening, that happened afterwards. I hate to say thanks to Ukraine, to the war in Ukraine, because we shouldn't be thanking for any war that shouldn't have happened. But security became the new paradigm for the EU and for the Western Balkans as well. And now, finally, after a little bit more, or a little bit more than a year, the European Union seems to have realized that enlargement is its geostrategic necessity. And I think this should work well for the Balkans, because as we know from history, Balkans can trigger serious crises in Europe, and no one wants that to happen. So looking at the EU now into the future, and what someone coming from the Western Balkans I would hope for the EU in the coming years, is really to adhere to its key principles, to its foundation, going back really to foundations, to democracy, to rule of law, to insisting that each of the countries, each of the new candidates is fully aligned with EU foreign policy, insisting that all bilateral issues, be it political or territorial, are resolved before the accession to the EU, and then also doing it, as you said, listening to what it says, how it talks to the rest of the world. I think it's important, at least for the Western Balkans, to talk in a more determined, precise, and I won't say threatening, but credible voice, describing what needs to happen in order for things to take place. The clear path of enlargement with rewards and punishments for situations when that does not occur.
Thank you, Maya. So Pedro, again, I'm turning to you. Especially from a Brazilian point of view, Brazil is a member of the BRICS. You are a global power, and you are also a power which is more and more important in the world. What role should, according to you, what role should the EU play in this new global order?
Well, I think that since you want the Brazilian perspective, we want the EU as partners with Brazil, like the EU has been on many occasions and is right now, a partner in defending multilateral institutions, a rules-based system, shared values. So that's where we see ourselves working together with the EU. And the point I made at the end of my previous intervention, I think that the real added value that the EU can bring to the table is its vast daily experience in forging consensus, because Ambassador, he was ambassador to the EU, and he knows how the EU works on a daily basis among the member states, among the different areas of the Commission, with the European Parliament, other institutions. It's a permanent negotiation. So I think that when we look forward to a new world, if you want, even though I do not necessarily share as a Brazilian representative this view that we are entering into this era of geopolitical rivalry in which we have to choose sides and everything is about conflict. We have a much different vision of the kind of world that we're living in, that we want. I think that the role of the EU should be of a consensus builder with other countries, together with other countries. And what it should not, I think, should try to avoid sometimes is that instead of being a partner, trying to be a tutor, or trying to kind of say that its way or its agenda or its rules are the ones that the world needs. Talking with us, building consensus, I think that is necessary. And dialogue and consultation are words that have meaning. Sometimes when you're in Brussels, you hear about, oh, we are going to have consultations. But at the end of the day, nobody's really listening to what, for example, some developing countries are saying. So I think that there should be an extra effort in listening, really. And I would suggest to the members of the conclave who are going to be here until the white smoke comes out of the chimney, that you take a look, if you haven't already, at High Representative Borrell's speech to his ambassadors, which is a very interesting document. You will probably read it in a different way than I read it, but before coming here, it was a bit my inspiration to participate. If I had total freedom of expression here today, which I unfortunately don't because of my current position, there are many issues there in that speech that I would comment, because I think that it kind of gives you a roadmap in terms of not your challenges as the European Union inside, but in the world. Because there's something very interesting that he said about where the European Union should pay attention or should focus. From the point of view of a Brazilian ambassador, I am very realistic about the bandwidth, this attention span that the EU can have for Brazil, because the EU has so many challenges. You can see them as concentric circles, you can see them as areas of interest, that it can't always have time for Brazil or for South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And I understand that. It's part of the game, but that's why it needs to talk more and to really have a dialogue with other partners and work together with us, because I think that's the way forward.
Thank you, Pedro. I think we would come back to some of the issues you raised, the two of you. Tony, you already started to invite the EU to handle in a different way. Maybe you will make it be more precise on some of these issues for the future?
I started by saying that the EU does play a significant role. It's often underestimated, but it is obviously living far below its potential for reasons that we all know, but some of them are structural and are going to be very difficult to solve. Demographics is one of them, but some of them are maybe not as structural and could be addressed. I mean, energy costs is one. Its capacity to innovate is challenged. Look, I saw a statistic recently that really jumped out of the page at me. Maybe many of you know this. The EU GDP has gone down from 91% of the US GDP in 2013 to 65% today. That is really bad news. The capacity of the continent to continue to innovate and grow will be absolutely essential to its future. That much is obvious. And I'm very happy to see that Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi are now writing these two reports. And I just want to cite two things that Draghi said, with which I agree completely. He says the extent of integration in the so-called banking and capital markets is lamentable due to nationalism on the part of governments, regulators, and national central banks. True. Seamlessness of the single market is still significantly impeded by inadequate interconnections in transport, energy, and telecommunications. True. The EU is underperforming internally, but gets back to your question about its external focus as well. That needs to change. The Lisbon Treaty tried to address this by making it pretty clear in the text about who does what, the President of the Commission and the Council and the High Representative. And it seemed to be working pretty well when I was at post. They weren't really stepping on each other's toes. The situation today is clearly not working, to be diplomatic. I mean, to have the President of the Council and the President of the Commission asking for separate meetings with the President of the United States simply cannot occur. I'm not even referring here about Sofagate or about having, discussions or commentary about the Middle East which are rowed back or contradicted the next day, and there's total confusion about, what the policy of the EU is. It's embarrassing, and it has to change. And maybe it doesn't have to change through treaty change, Philippe. You're the expert. Maybe there can be some kind of an MOU that is signed by the next Commission, very clearly detailing who does what at what level and who speaks for the EU. I think that would be a big improvement.
I think that there has been arrangements in the past. I'm not anymore in Brussels, but for instance, distributing the roles between the President of the European Council, the President of the European Commission, who was the lead for G7, who was the lead for G20, for instance. But I think everybody understands what you say. I would like to come back to one point you made on, Tony, in your first intervention, on the EU should be more focused. There seems to me a sort of contradiction between this point and the point of becoming a geopolitical actor, because if you are a geopolitical actor, you have to be ready to step in all the important questions which can be raised in the international order. And one of the good examples for this, maybe the most important one, would be security and defense. And if we can ask you about your opinions about what in the future the European Union, what role the European Union should have as a security provider for the world. By security provider, I mean not only defense in the traditional ways, but also the whole range of new threats to security, especially, but not only in the cyberspace or in the space, outer space, at sea, in the oceans, all new domains of conflictuality in the world. So what would be your view, the three of you, about this future role of the European Union in a world which is objectively more and more threatening, more and more dangerous, more and more conflictual? Oh, whoever wants to talk. No order anymore. Your choice.
Well, look, so I disagree, I'm glad to say, with what you said.
I hope.
So geopolitical actor, yes, but it doesn't need or should need to speak on every issue.
I didn't say that.
Well, okay. But look,
I just said there might be a contradiction, but...
I look at the organogram of, as I was saying, with the External Action Service, and I was struck by this when I was tracking the travel schedule of the High Representative, and I said, why, it was she, why is she going to all these places? The EU has very little influence in some of these places. There are clear areas where the EU does count: Balkans, Africa, humanitarian, foreign aid, is a trading power I mentioned, on sanctions for sure, but there, and I don't want to specify the countries or specifically where, but there are many cases where the EU really should say, do we actually need to have so many people, and do we need to have an active policy? I know that's slightly provocative. It should focus on what it does well. Now, in terms of...
And my question was not a geographical question, it's more horizontal.
Well, it's very quickly on security, because you have more experts here, but I was struck at the very positive role that the EU plays in its security missions in some countries in Africa. Small, very modest, but I spoke to many of our four-star generals who said the EU actually is playing a real additive role in Mali and in some other countries. And they're doing things which we cannot or do not want to do. So that's a good example, all right? Maybe less so now because we've had a number of setbacks in Africa. Anti-piracy missions, for sure. Enlargement, I would argue, is also a security issue. It is generating, expanding the sphere of the common values, Pedro, you were talking about. I think that's also relevant from a security point of view. But here will be the last thing I would say, I'll be provocative. This whole discussion about strategic autonomy inside the Brussels bubble, when I was ambassador, I found to be a real, almost a distraction, a real distraction. I personally would like to see a Europe that is less dependent on others, including the United States, for its security. But strategic autonomy, I think, is a dream that will never occur because the populations of Europe do not want to spend the money, and there is no political will to achieve that goal, and Europe doesn't necessarily need to get there. It can be less dependent, including on critical minerals. Reducing dependencies, whether it's on Russia for energy, whether it's on China for rare earths, there are lots of examples. That, yes, and it's desirable. But strategic autonomy, I don't think is something that will happen.
Well, how do you define strategic autonomy? What is the content of it which will not happen?
Being able to act without consideration of others. Being truly independent. I don't think Europe is in that position.
But if strategic autonomy is to be able to have the capacity to decide for ourselves, you agree with it? To have the capacity to take the decisions we deem necessary to take for our interest, a collective interest as European Union. There you would agree with strategic autonomy.
Yes, but Europe will never be uniquely capable of providing for its own defense without regard for others. Maybe that's what I was saying.
No, without regard to others and without the others is different. I mean, without regard for others, it is not strategic autonomy, in my opinion. You have to take views on other, especially allies, but also all other partners in the world. But to have the capacity to act. I just try to push you because behind words you have to we all agree on this, to see what we speak about. But thank you for precising your answer on this. May I ask also Maya and Pedro to answer my question from their viewpoint on the security provider issue?
Let me try that. I come from the camp that firmly believes that enlargement is geopolitical investment in the European security. That doesn't mean, absolutely, not necessarily, but that doesn't mean that EU should accept 9 or even 10 members in the next couple of years, because definitely that will be a horrible move and a threat and it will destroy the security of the European Union if it happened today. But that means, and that's I really want to really mention the amazing report, inspiring report. I haven't read such good analysis for a long time, exciting also, which is rare for analysis of this kind, Sailing on High Seas, Enlarging and Reforming Europe. I really think if there's anyone in this room who hasn't read it, I definitely recommend. In addition to being very specific and optimistic in case the right things are done at the right pace, it's also encouraging each side to do its work, to understand that there is responsibility on the EU, but also on the rest of the world, especially on the candidates, on the countries that are interested to become one day the members of the EU. That's why I already mentioned the 3 principles out of 9 as recommended criteria for enlargement for the EU, to the EU, but the first three is really enough. If Western Balkans countries would comply with those, and I repeat, the rule of law, the geostrategic alliance with EU foreign policy, and resolving all bilateral issues before entrance to the EU would look different, and Western Balkans would definitely look much better today.
Thank you. Pedro?
I have maybe a bit of a different view, because I think it's complicated to mix the issue of security with other agendas. That's not the way, at least from Brazil, we like to go forward with things. If we're going to talk about the environment, let's talk about the environment. If we're going to talk about, let's say, transnational illicit activities and crime, international criminal networks, and how to deal with that, if we're going to talk about the issue of drugs, or if we're going to talk, at least you said about the issue of the seas and security of the seas. If we're going to talk about all these issues, let's talk about them
each of them
separate, and not give them all a security component, because if you give everything now a security component, everything becomes like something like a struggle between countries and different sides, and
because for you security implies opposition.
If we're going to talk about these issues, the big issues of security, I would stick with the classic issues of non-proliferation, of disarmament, or we're going to have a military dialogue or a defense dialogue. That for me is security. The rest are other issues. So maybe here I have a...
No, it is.
It's a different visual. And then you, not to run away from your question, what is the role for the EU? Here I'll give a very diplomatic answer, but I think it's the truth. It will be up to the member states of the European Union have to decide which are the areas in which they're going to give a bigger role to the EU and its institutions. So far, it's not that big of a role. It has been increasing in recent years, but it will be up to you to decide. In the case of Brazil, we don't have that much engagement strictly in terms of security, of a security agenda. But Tony mentioned the issue of the peace operations. There we have been contributing, and we have been invited to contribute, for example, in capacity building in some countries, like in African countries. And finally, if you allow me, you have raised a concept which is a complicated concept, generates concern for us, which is this concept of strategic autonomy.
Tony mentioned it.
Yeah, which is...
I didn't do it first.
So it's his fault.
I didn't do it first.
But it's an interesting concept.
If you start speaking about this, I know you can take 1.5 hours.
No, I won't. I won't. I would just say that it is a concept that when we see it, us, the Brazilian diplomats who are working with the EU and with the US and with other partners, other countries that are our partners, it is cause for concern, because how far are you going to stretch it? What does that mean? What are the repercussions? Because of course you need to have your interests always at heart and think about your country and your population, etc. But how far are you going to stretch the strategic autonomy discussion. It's a heated debate that's out there every day in the press, so I won't say any more on that. Well, not to hijack your panel.
It's a heated debate also because, as I said, people don't understand, I think, the same thing under this. But okay, thank you for answering this question, which leads me into another subject, which is, before turning to some of the points you made, especially the technology, which Tony made a point on technology, which is linked to independence, sovereignty, and I would like to come back to this. But first, on this new international order, and all those discussions, I was recently in New York, we had a panel on the global south. Okay, so we have here Brazil, and we have also Europe, represented by Maya, and the United States. What is your view of what actor the European Union should be in the organization of the world of tomorrow? The EU is, as such, and you said it, a model, you said, based on consensus. Well, I would say not always consensus, because we cannot reach decisions only by consensus, but we have this model of cooperation. We represent ourselves as EU, a model of international cooperation inside. And this international cooperation is more and more in crisis. At the UN, we see more and more difficulty to reach decisions, especially in the Security Council. And we see more and more oppositions, fractures, divisions. So, in your opinion, in what capacity should the EU appear in this new? Should we use this model we have been representing since the beginning of our history, since the 1950s, to be, as you said, to continue to champion multilateralism? Should we be more assertive? And I guess you will have not necessarily the same answers between the two ambassadors, and Maya also may have a different point of view.
Jake Sullivan gave a very interesting speech in April of this year to the Brookings Institute. I don't know how many of you have read it, but it's really, really worth reading, because in it he suggests what could be a doctrine for a second Biden term. So obviously I'm partisan and I strongly favor this administration, but he says some things in that speech which are really worth reflecting on, because it says the Washington consensus has basically run its course. The things that we used to believe in, like liberalization, privatization, and free trade and other things, right? Well, they were good while they lasted, but we're kind of beyond that now, and something else has to take its place and reorder the world on different principles. And I say this because you mentioned the word multilateralism, but we say we do believe in multilateralism, but it's going to have to adapt. The rules are going to have to adapt, and I do worry where we are going when we say the era of big government is now back, big time. The role of government now is bigger than it's been since the FDR days in the New Deal. It used to be under Ronald Reagan that big government was the problem. Now it's the solution to almost everything through subsidies and everything else. Is that really the way we want to go? Well, question mark. Are we really prepared to not abandon, no one would say that word, but to basically say free trade? We don't, that word is almost toxic in the United States. Even the set of principles for Asian, the EPEF principles, we couldn't even get that done because there weren't enough labor standards in EPEF, and that's not even a free trade agreement. And we're not even prepared to talk about US-EU, not to forget about TTIP, but something even smaller. Are we willing to walk away from those principles? I say all of this because the EU is going to play a critical role in saying, well, we have to protect the system. It wasn't all that bad, and by the way, it's still relevant. It raised a lot of people out of poverty. It actually made both sides, it made the world richer. Maybe we didn't compensate the losers enough, but it made the world richer. But the EU should be a trendsetter and a thinker about how we need to adapt multilateralism to the new age. and not only through reform of the WTO, but putting more pressure on China, here I'll be provocative, to change its behavior. Rules are not enough. Coercion is going to be necessary. And I say this because the EU, quite rightly, has now said enforcement is important. Level playing field in procurement is important. Toughening up foreign direct investment rules is important. Toughening up export control measures is important. All of those things have to happen. But protect the system.
May I be provocative myself? Pressure on China or also pressure on the US?
And I hope you will.
By American
if Trump
act?
wins in November of next year, I will say this openly. I hope the EU...
I said on the US in general.
Well, but also Biden, okay, fine. If you've pushed back on subsidies as well, I have my own question mark about where all of this is going. But if Trump wins, I do hope the EU will play that role in saying we need to protect the system. And that man will try to blow it up. So I hope the EU will do that.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting you, but it's more lively. And I would like now to hear the voice from the South.
Apart from reading Mr. Borrell's address to the ambassadors this morning, I read the speeches that my president made at the G77, the G20, the BRICS, and my minister also at the UN, etc. And I was reflecting on all of that, and now we have this. I'm not a big fan of this term of the Global South. Like I'm not also the fan of the idea of the North, nor of the concept of the West, because who's the West? Brazil thinks it's the West, but I don't think others think it is the West. And some of the countries that are in the North are not actually in the North, and they are not Western. So none of these concepts really works very well, but since my president spoke about these concepts, and he said something that was interesting, which is a commonality of interests. That's the simple way to put it. So since we're here to talk about the EU and the future of the EU and not about Brazil and what, not about the other countries that were mentioned here, I think what the EU can bring to the table is to continue to champion all that we built together since the Second World War and even before. The European countries, the system, the rules, the organizations. And I sometimes I'm very concerned when I go to events, even, for example, events full of young people at the European Parliament. I was invited to a very interesting event called Beyond Trade, and you can imagine what the agenda was. And one of the panelists, who was a professor, said that we need the unilateralism of the means for the multilateralism of the results. And I almost got up and left. But that's the kind of thing that you're hearing more and more in Brussels, since we're talking about Brussels. And I think we should be very careful. And I go back to the comment I made about listen to what you say, not only listen to us, which is, if you practice selective multilateralism, if you say, listen, the rules don't work anymore, so now we're going to do this. There are some rules for you, there are some rules for me and my friends. There are some rules for acquaintances, and there are rules for those that are close to us or share our views. You're putting yourself in a complicated situation, because then you're going to have to go back to all the other countries and generate consensus. So I think that when I look at the future, and sometimes with concern, and having not as long as you, but for 30 years worked on diplomacy and dialogue and conversation, I am concerned with the idea that since we can't wait for consensus, we're going to do what we want or what we need. So I think that I hope the EU will continue like it has for many years, being a partner, for example, of Brazil at the World Trade Organization, at the UN, and at other international fora, building the basis for consensus and for us tackling together the many challenges that we have: environmental, climate change, hunger, poverty, inequality, issues that also I think should be more in the world view of the EU. even though there are other things that are close to its daily interests, such as security. And I hope that we continue to have that work with the EU. That would be my answer to you.
Thank you. Maya, you are from a different perspective. You are from a future member state, but you see also the very difficult conditions and in this region and the necessity of reconciliation. Do you see yourself as a future part of a geopolitical actor, or mostly now as in the middle of a difficult process for peace in the Western Balkans? Or do you already project yourself as a part of the European Union of tomorrow?
Yeah, interesting question. I had an interview this morning. A journalist asked me, do you think that in our lifetime, Serbia will become a member of the European Union? And I said, my boy, you're much younger than I am, so let's first agree on the lifetime, what do we expect? But, thinking about, I think those words were said first time by Charles Michel, that European Union should be ready, enlargement ready by 2030. And now, especially after reading the report which I've mentioned, I do believe that is possible, and that only means that EU should be ready. And talking about the potential new members, candidates for new members, I'm not sure that they will be enlargement ready until and unless they start doing the complicated homework which they have to do. I don't know how much people know about the situation in Serbia, but it's a very good example of the country that really needs deep reforms, first in the area of rule of law, fight against corruption, because corruption is a sickness that Western Balkans are deeply engaged in, so to say. And then, in addition to mentioning we talked about Zeitenwende, I'd like to mention Zeit in a different context, of which I often think these days. I think of Zeitnot, and I think everyone knows about what that means, at least from chess, if no other use. But I think that European Union, Europe, and the world is in a kind of Zeitnot. And in this case, I think that's good, because it can motivate us to do the things which we were not willing or ready to do in the past. And I would really hope that this Zeitnot sentiment in the middle of Zeitenwende should push us all in the direction to, we do have to listen how our words sign. But then at the end of the day, I think we should go back to, what you do speaks louder than what you say. And I think we all have a task on the what you do part, both the EU and, again, now talking about Western Balkans, the things that need to happen there. I think that sense of urgency is really important, and the clear path towards the membership, clear path for reform. EU is aware it needs to reform. EU today can barely function with the current member of 27 members, not even thinking about admitting new ones. I, as coming from one of the potential candidates, would not recommend allowing any of the countries of the Western Balkans to access the EU today.
Thank you for this very candid answer, also a very important one. We have 20 minutes left, and I don't want to forget the possibility for my colleagues to ask questions. But yes, Tony, please, you wanted to add something?
Just one thing. It struck me, we haven't mentioned the word Ukraine, which I thought was kind of interesting. So, and it directly relates to what you were saying in terms of what we expect, I hope the EU to do. I hope the EU fulfills and lives up to its obligations in Ukraine, because the US might not. If Trump comes to power, there will be a president who will essentially want to sell Ukraine to the Russians at a low price. And even if not, we have a Speaker of the Congress who is an essential isolationist, doesn't particularly care. I think if Ukraine we don't get Ukraine right by getting to a negotiated solution and we rebuild, then Europe will never be at peace. And I want Europe to be stable, prosperous, democratic. We have to, and I hope this will be addressed by the conclave. And I think a phased enlargement, it doesn't have to be all at once or all in there, everything or nothing. A phased enlargement is going to be absolutely essential. It has to be a stable member and a successful member of the European family.
Thank you for reminding us of that. Would the public like to ask some questions? I have many questions on my side, but I would prefer you to use this opportunity if you agree. I see if everybody can introduce him or herself. I see a question there.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks so much for this fascinating conversation. And my name is Samantha Cristoforetti. I'm with the European Space Agency. A question for Ambassador Gardner. I think you very bluntly said that I think strategic autonomy for Europe is a dream that will never happen. And I wonder what you see as the alternative. Because when I think about strategic autonomy and ability to decide without relying on others, I think most of us also think of some level of autonomy from the United States. And I think that the reason why a lot of us think that is that we don't necessarily assume that forever the United States will be willing and interesting in providing for our security. So what do you think the alternative would be? You think that we are just condemned to like rely on continuing goodwill, or I'm just curious.
I agree with what's behind your question. I do want to see a Europe that is more self-reliant and less dependent on others. But there were a few polls which really hit me. They're dated a few years ago. And Europeans were asked, would you come to the defense of a fellow European member state if attacked by a non-European power? And there were minorities who said yes. Minorities who said yes. Most people, let me put it that way. First, in terms of defense spending, I may be slightly out of date here, but I looked at the case of Belgium, poor Belgium. I'm picking on Belgium for a second. It spends 1% of its 550 billion euro GDP on defense. And I think I'm right in saying 60% of that is spent on things that are not relevant to combat capability, meaning pensions and salaries, okay? So I agree with the thrust of what you're saying. I do want to see Europe that is more self-reliant, but the political will doesn't seem to be there, except in the case of some Poland, Baltic states. Germany has promised a lot, but has it actually delivered on what it said it's going to do? It's going to take a very long time. The space program, it seems to be a good example maybe where, okay, I shouldn't be so skeptical, right? I'm just saying I don't see the deeds following the rhetoric, and I'm not sure that's going to change anytime soon.
So, if I can sum up your message, it's an appeal to the Europeans to do things themselves. It's a good provocation for us. Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, Maria?
Okay, I have the mic.
So. Okay. Sorry. Can you introduce?
Peter Ark, Polish Economic Institute. I just wanted to comment on one of the words from Ambassador Gardner and ask a question to follow up on that. So you made an example of the metric of the GDP of EU comparing to the US in the last 20 years. And then, most of the changes in the valuation of the European economy comes from the depreciation of the euro comparing to the US dollar and the appreciation of the US dollar. So the EU is basically exporting more than the US in the last years. That's why we have issues with China, because this is a big domestic market for the European economies. And we're growing slower than the US, but not as much as this indicator shows. So this is just a clarification on that. And we talked about trade, you discussed geopolitics, but the name of the WTO didn't come up, and this is strange for me. Do you believe that as NATO wants, maybe the WTO is brain dead? Thank you.
Yes, the question was not only for Tony, it was very much also for a Brazilian representative.
I was in Geneva for the birth of the WTO, and I worked there when the appellate body started drafting its rules of procedure, and so on and so forth. And we need the European Union helping us keep alive the WTO, what is left of it. And I think here I can put forward some words of encouragement. If there are members of the WTO that have been working hard to keep it alive, the European Union is one of them. And I think Brazil is a partner there, and we have a series of other countries that are interested in the system. What we have to be careful about is the issues that start coming on the table. For example, the European Union and others have proposed that we change the definition or the rules about, for example, industrial subsidies when we haven't talked about agricultural subsidies. And other members want to change, for example, if you can have trade rules that are linked to security issues, national security, Article 21 of the GATT. And then you could do whatever you want if it's based on national security. So we have to make sure what WTO we want for the future.
I have a question for Maya, also following up on this. You mentioned regional cooperation in the Western Balkans as something which could help and lead into accession. And at the very beginning, the European Union, the European Steel and Coal Community at the very beginning was a combination of a political will and economic instruments. So it's a model which we have had from the very beginning. Do you think that in the Western Balkans, this regional cooperation in the fields of trade, economy, can effectively be the decisive tool for this, the success of this accession process?
The short answer is yes. And I think that would be the most realistic path at this moment, because that can start. Why? I can answer with, it's economy stupid. The reconciliation that still hasn't happened in the Western Balkans. The best way to push things forward is to show benefits to the people, benefits to the citizens. And regional integration should be, economic integration, which I'm talking about, should be ideally above the political will, because it should be driven by business, and businesses employ people, and people have families. And once they realize that they are living better today than they lived 2 years ago, because they're opening the borders in a credible way, not for smuggling, but for trade between the countries, that brings more food on the table for their families, they will be willing to maybe quiet down. Alexander Vučić is talking about, some of the things, I'll never give away, this and that, and Serbian independence, but say, okay, let me look what's in my fridge instead of what I hear on TV. That's why I really do believe that that's the way forward. Again, that has to be a credible path as well. So in order, because if European Union would give access to the market of 16 million, which is the Western Balkans, compared to 450 million, all Balkan economies will simply collapse, and it will be a matter of days. So they do have to get ready, they do have to work together, and they have to be closely monitored, supervised, and punished by the EU if they don't do the homework. There shouldn't be any compromises on that, because that wouldn't be good for anyone. But yes, if you think, of course, in parallel, we should not give away the idea of the enlargement starting from 2030. But there is a lot that can be done today And because of the geopolitical insecurity, and don't forget, the biggest leverage in that part in Europe, south of the EU, Russia has in Serbia and Bosnia. But Serbia-Kosovo conflict, if that was resolved, Russia will lose its key leverage in the Balkans. So these are things that have to happen. And again, economy should happen, at least alleviate that problem in a way.
Thank you. And I have also a follow-up question on this question of trade for Tony, because you mentioned Jake Sullivan's speech, recognizing that free trade is maybe not anymore the multilateral value which would be recognized by the US, which is new. And even if I understand what you said, Tony, did he mention also the financial institutions? Bretton Woods institutions. But anyway, my question is, what would be the role of the EU for you in their relation with the US on these issues of multilateralism in trade and financial issues, considering this new policy on the US side?
We'll try to keep it alive. The WTO is not dead. It needs to be reformed. The trouble is, it's taking a really long time. And right now, we have a dispute settlement system which doesn't work. So now,
but we are ready on the EU side to reform it. The problem is to find a partner.
Yeah, well, don't give up, I guess, is my message. Okay. Don't give up and try to, look, when I read the papers that have been filed by the EU and, well, in the US, certainly the EU has filed a really good series of white papers on what needs to change. And I think the US actually has some relevant, justifiable complaints.
We never
exactly.
We never refused this.
Unfortunately, for reasons I just don't understand, we haven't been able to address some of the core issues, which I understand is judge-made law. And the ability of judges, well, we understand how this happens. They fill in the blanks in the law through judgments that are then cited by judgments later on. And we feel, the United States feels, not only Trump, but also this administration feel, the institution is not working as it was intended to work, and the Chinese have abused the system in a way that we didn't anticipate when it became a member. But I'm still hopeful we can find some measure of overlap here to save the system, because the alternative is the law of the jungle. And I would just say to those in the United States who perhaps think the United States is big enough that it doesn't really matter, I would say, beware what you wish for, because the law of the jungle actually may not be a great world for us either. And on a related note, I would have said to my colleagues now in Washington, who said everybody should subsidize to their heart's content because the more the better. I say, beware what you wish for. We used to want to control subsidies and to have a multilateral system of controlling subsidies. If you say, let everyone subsidize, beware what happens in the single market. I would say this to John Podesta, who said to the EU, you should subsidize like we do. Okay, John, the result is that 60% of all European subsidies are French and German subsidies. Now tell me how...
I would say German and French.
German and French, in that order. Now, is that a good thing for the survival of the single market? So I'm just saying the rules actually do matter, and I think those rules benefit all of us.
No, absolutely. My question and your answer were more about the future role of the US than of the EU, actually. But it's also an important question for us. Yes, Maya, please. There are other questions.
I just want...
we have still 15 minutes plus, yes? I think so. We have time.
I just wanted to mention one curious fact, because we've mentioned China a couple of times, and again, I want to bring it to the Western Balkans. I don't know if anyone in this room is aware that China is the biggest single investor in Serbia. And when I say single investor, I mean the EU, as another investor of 27 countries, invests equally or less than China in Serbia today. So that is the kind of threat that I'm trying to talk about in the era when geoeconomics has become the new geopolitics.
The order would not be the same, Maya, under your control if we compared not investments, but financial support.
Absolutely. Just talking literally investment. Yes. I agree. But still.
No, I say that because the European Union is a major donor in the world, but there's very, very important investment through development aid or subventions or support in different technical fields is not very visible. But
I agree.
You're
but
right.
This is strategic investment in infrastructure, in things that matter.
And it might be also a field of reflection for the future. So I give back the floor to the public. We have a question on the first row and on the third row. Maybe Maria João. Maria.
Okay, Maria João Rodrigues. I'm a member of the Conclave Board. Very interesting panel. Many thanks. And I'm building on the last comment by Maya, because in fact I'd like to bring to the table the following question: how to deal with China? And more specifically, what can you tell us about the way your countries deal with China? And how do you perceive the way the European Union is dealing with China? So this is the question.
Is this a question for me or for each one of us? Oh, okay. For Serbia, this answer is unfortunately fairly easy, because Serbia has been labeled as a captured state in the European Union reports. Captured state meaning state in which institutions are captured. This is a fertile ground for China investment, because they can agree easily on lucrative deals with governments in the Western Balkans, with no transparency, no control, no information exchanged with citizens on how and when these deals are going to come back for payment and how this whole thing is going to work. So if you ask what EU should be doing, is try, of course, not to compete with China and the way they're doing business, but be more energetic and less bureaucratic in the way that it engages in similar kind of investment in the Western Balkans. It has to be, China is faster. China has enormous funds available, and it doesn't ask for any control mechanisms or doesn't care about anything. And that's very dangerous for the countries in that part of the world, because we don't know what we are facing and how long will our kids and grandkids have to pay off the debts to China.
The main investor in terms of stock of investments in Brazil is the European Union and the European Union member states. And for Brazil, as I said in the beginning, the European Union is one of our main export markets, actually our second one. And China is our main trading partner. And we have excellent relations with China in all areas, from trade to science and technology to health to all issues. We have a political dialogue and a structure of relationship with them, as we have with the European Union. Of course, I, as a Brazilian ambassador to the EU, will not comment on what the EU should do. And we also have excellent relationships and excellent dialogue with the United States, and we try to have it with all countries. So that's all I would say on that point.
So we're coming to the end here, and I want to be provocative. Is that okay? Okay. Here goes. So the EU, I think, will be judged in the United States by both sides of the aisle by one major criterion, and that is, what good is the EU if not to join with us in handling the Chinese challenge, period. If the EU isn't relevant in working with us to address the Chinese challenge, then we don't really need it, okay? I'm just saying that's reality on both sides of the aisle in Congress. There are steps in that direction. where we're taking in partnership. I'm thinking member states, the Dutch, Japanese, US agreement on blocking of some types of very advanced equipment, whether it's ASML, the advanced lithography machines and chips and so forth. We're seeing the EU act as well in a way that catches the US attention on anti-coercion, on foreign direct investment rules, on export control rules toughening, on public procurement rules that threaten to shut off Europe's very large and attractive public procurement market to countries that don't play by the same rules, whether it's China or, by the way, or the United States. It could be as well. And the focus on enforcement. And now the threat of dumping by the Chinese of electric vehicle batteries and so forth. All of that, I think, goes in the right direction. The EU and the United States need to work, hopefully in partnership, better and more on dealing with the Chinese economic challenge.
Yes, don't look at me like that. No, but if I may react to this, of course the EU has taken just recently on EV vehicles, imports from China increasing a lot. Our tariffs were much lower than the American tariffs. So there is also a reason. But I have another provocative question follow-up question for you, Tony. Why? Even if we recognize that we have overlapping interests in our relations with China in terms of interests and democracy and so on, why should the EU align on the US in cases where, in theory, I don't mention one special case, our interests would not be exactly the same interest as our American friends, which can happen also. Do you recognize this?
Of course, of course. Naturally, as I said, I'm a dual national. So Europe will not have the same interests as the United States. And by the way, I don't think the United States has ever said you need to, completely choose sides, because there will be areas of cooperation, even for the United States with China. There are quite a few of them, whether it's on climate change or non-proliferation and on reducing, potential for military conflict. There are others, right? And in Europe, Europe's economic future is arguably more tied to Chinese growth than the United States is. So yes, there are going to be divergences, but as a general matter, I think there's more that we should be doing together in being clear-eyed about Chinese desire to acquire cutting-edge technologies that will serve its ability to control the technologies of the future, whether it's AI or nano or quantum and other areas.
Okay, and it is a special expectation from any administration in the US?
For sure.
Related to the EU, more related to the EU than related to other partners of the US?
Well, Japan and South Korea for sure on chips, and we're seeing that right now, yeah.
Other questions? Yes? Well, plenty of questions. So the gentleman here, yes, in the middle.
Okay, Lucas Soukalis. I have a perhaps provocative question addressed mostly to my former student, Tony. And talking about multilateralism, we know that in today's international economic institutions, notably the IMF and the World Bank, the distribution of the power of decision-making does not correspond at all to the distribution of trade shares and income shares. Is the United States, or should the EU and the United States be willing to reconsider transferring some of that power to the global south, and perhaps not, instead of simply asking them to change, asking them also to take more responsibility for the running of those institutions? Would that be a positive way of helping China and others to change?
It's Lucas, it's interesting because I literally had my notes here saying IMF, World Bank needs to reflect better the distribution of economic power in the world. I think that's where things are going. I think this administration has actually made a statement to that regard. The desire will be for some sort of distribution. Am I correct? We've actually been on the record to saying we want that. How is that going to look like? I'm not so sure. But I agree, that would be, I think, a positive contribution. How can we not do that if we expect China to be a responsible member of this community, if we don't recognize it and spend accordingly and live up to those rules. Am I wrong on the facts, Philippe? Haven't we?
Well, it's. I think the good intentions are there, but as I was ambassador in the United States, I've seen how it is difficult to pass through the Congress the new policy of the IMF with supplementary drawing rights, and did not happen. So I think your professor's question is quite justified in the principle, because to move this system, to reform the World Bank also, it's another issue for the American position. We need to reform the World Bank to make the World Bank more active in raising money for developing countries. So the role of the US will be essential. But we're here to speak about the role of the EU also, and I think Luca's question is also very relevant here, because it should define more than ever the future role of the EU, together with the US and other major stakeholders in the South, like Brazil. And here, of course, countries from the North, not only the US, but also the European Union, are called to maybe to move to give more influence to other countries. It's my view also. There are plenty of questions, so who has the mic speaks and introduces himself.
My name is Stéphane Collignon.
And it will be the last question Erika said. I'm sorry for the other question asking people.
I would like to remind us of the important point that Maya made, which is that China is swamping the world, buying it up, and without conditionality, without imposing conditions of economic soundness. And it has already bought Brazil. I mean, I'm surprised what I hear about Brazil here, siding with all the bad guys in this world. And then we get this beautiful talk about how it is with Europe. But redistribution the weights in the world without insisting on conditionality in the IMF and international institutions, I think is pure suicide. And we must insist that that should happen. So our aim, if we had a European strategy, would be to destroy BRICS and to side with America to reduce the influence of China. Thank you.
Is it a question or?
It's a provocation.
I don't think that I will respond to that. Too many concepts that I just don't share. I didn't catch his name, but I don't share that view. I think that's the view that I think is going to lead us into a lot of trouble, dividing the world into good and bad guys, and deciding that some countries have to hold some other countries' hands, and that if you're not with us, you're against us. I think that is not going to solve anything. I'm answering. I shouldn't, right? No, I think that goes back to what I said in the beginning. The idea that Europe knows best what is good for my country is something that is just not acceptable. The EU should not see itself as a tutor to anybody. It can see itself as a partner. It can see itself, if it wants, as an adversary, as an opponent, but not as a tutor. No credentials to be a tutor of anybody. And that's when I said, listen to what you're saying to us, because when I hear this kind of idea that we should know better who we are having relations with, etc., it goes to the core of this perception in many countries that there is a double standard, that there is an incapacity to listen, to hear what the other one is saying. So I think that really, if Europe wants to have relevance in the future world order and in this new geopolitical stage, it needs to do so out of a position, starting from a position of respect of the one who's sitting on the other side of the table. So, of course, and I respect differing views from the ones of my country, but I think that we are only going to get to solutions if we try to bridge the gap, with full respect for differences of opinion.
Of course. No, thank you very much. It was a very good point to be made at the end of our exchange. And since it's exactly, I think, Madam Chair, we... Exactly, and we did it at least very well in keeping to the time which had been given to us. So let me thank our three panelists, Maya, Pedro, and Tony. Thank you for your very deep and candid reflections. And thank you for giving this input for our works in the conclave. No, I think, Erika, you will announce something important now.
First of all, I want to apologize for disturbing this very interesting conversation. I think we could continue for a very long time, but that's why we now have a coffee break, so we can continue talking about these very important issues. It's always a bit dangerous to give the power of moderating a session to a Swede, because we tend to be very punctual. And you know, in Sweden they usually say that, you know, if you're invited for 7, people will arrive 15 minutes early and sit in the car and wait until it's exactly 7 o'clock. But that also means that now there's a coffee break outside, and then we come back exactly at 15 to start with the next session. So this will be a good opportunity to get to know each other and to continue these very interesting conversations. And I'm so happy to see that again and again this point is coming up of we need a new narrative. We need to speak to each other in a different way, and the old patterns of thinking are probably not the right ones to find the right solutions for the 21st century. So thank you very much, everyone.